The other part of that is the rush and also the desire to keep costs low. And there's some really specific things that we'll talk about where they made the decision to do certain things to keep the costs low, and that ended up having really deadly consequences, right? And as they examined these two crashes, they found almost identical information from the onboard, instrument recordings, right? The black box, I guess is what it's called.
Right.
The black box recordings were, almost identical about the causes of both accidents. He was found dead in his car mid-deposition. He had been doing a deposition in South Carolina. He didn't show up. They went to look for him, and they found him dead in the car, gunshot wound to the head.
Some of these planes were having some stall problems, and obviously the data recorders and the pilots themselves are indicating, hey, we're having stall problems. So Boeing goes in and they introduce a new software to counteract these stall problems. Now, these software updates were done without FAA's recertification or knowledge. This is the part that's really bizarre. These software updates apparently will take over for the pilot if they detect something wrong. A lot of these pilots apparently were not aware of it, and apparently these two that went down were not aware of it.
A big part of Boeing's marketing of this jet to keep the cost low and to compete with the Airbus was them saying, hey, this requires no additional training. It's a turnkey jet, hop in and take off. And it turns out that wasn't the case. He was flying home and he was sitting in the cockpit with the pilots. Now, this is the same plane that crashed a couple days later. The plane went into a nosedive. The off-duty pilot this is the off-duty guy, correctly diagnosed the issue, disabled the flight control system, and saved the plane. The next day, completely different crew, right? So they hadn't experienced what had happened the day before. Literally the next day, it happened again, and everyone on board died. I mean, that's troubling. Don't you think that there would be some kind of turnover for those pilots coming on the plane the next day to say, hey, this plane had this issue 24 hours ago. Here's what happened. Here's how it was addressed. But apparently none of that happened. And it literally the next day, the same thing happened. And the pilots didn't, correctly assess the situation. And believe it or not, the Lion's jet or the Lion Airlines jet lacked some safety features because those safety features were sold as options by Boeing, additional cost options. So there was a warning light that would have said, hey, this system has been activated, et cetera, and it wasn't on this particular plane because it was an upgrade option that they didn't choose to get. Welcome to Truth Nation. I'm Bill Bodner. With me, the chief, retired chief. I know you get mad when I don't say retired. Mark
Well, I don't
Garrett.
get mad. It's just I like hearing it because
Oh, yeah.
it reminds me I'm not in that crap anymore.
Yeah. Do you feel retired, Mark?
Yeah, I do. I feel
Okay.
retired because whatever stress that I find myself in is almost all self-imposed now, which,
Yeah.
it's kind of a good place to be.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting discussion for another day, is how
Mhm.
much of stress is just personality based and how much of it is on external factors,
Mhm. Yeah.
Today, folks, I don't know, have you heard the saying, if it's Boeing, I'm not going? You might be the one that told me that saying, Mark, as we started talking about this. If it's Boeing, I ain't going.
You know what, Bill? I'm so glad you brought that up because the first time I heard that was from my father, who was in World War II,
Mm.
who hated to fly. And of course, he had to fly and transport, ships, planes sometimes, not often, but he lucky enough, he flew in Boeings, and that's the only plane he flew in. He loved it and had a good reputation. So he brought that back from World War II. If it ain't Boeing, I ain't going.
Yeah. What we're going
Yeah.
to talk about today, folks, is the Boeing company, the problems that they've had over the past, I don't know, 5, 6 years, but it really goes back much longer than that. I think with cultural issues inside the corporation and the reasons why those cultural issues started becoming problematic. Corporate deception and a broken regulatory process. Those are the two big things that I see as causing a lot of the issues that we're seeing today at Boeing, and also a drive to maximize shareholder return. And it seems like, Mark, every time we're talking about a corporation, whether it was the Purdue the Purdue Pharmacy Corporation, Purdue Pharma, back when we did a show called Crime of the Century, like the second or third podcast that we did,
Hmm.
that issue came up. And then even talking about social media platforms and their drive to maximize profits and probably prioritize those profits over child safety. Even just last week with COSA and the law in Florida, we saw kind of those same underlying things where this drive to maximize shareholder return ends up having a detrimental effect on public safety. And a lot of times it's because of government regulation that's supposed to be there that somehow gets tainted. So I think,
Yep.
Mark, the place to start with Boeing is at least somewhat modern day issues they have back in the 2000s, just to kind of give context and set the stage for what was going on at Boeing. There was competition in the commercial airliner production industry. And I think it was the 2011 air show in Paris, France. Airbus introduced this new plane called a Neo. What was it? What does it actually stand for? Like new engine option or something?
Oh, you got
And
me. I didn't know that
yeah,
acronym.
it was an Airbus 320 Neo, and
Hmm.
it kind of blew the world away. It was this fuel efficient airliner, and I think it took people by surprise. And it sounds like it took the people at Boeing by surprise. And within 48 hours of Airbus introducing that model plane and making it available for order, Boeing had decided to go with a re-engined 737. So they were, going to slap new engines on the thing that were more fuel efficient, make it a more fuel efficient and more cost effective, cheaper airliner to produce and sell and hence purchase. And that was going to be how they would compete with Boeing. And I think
With Airbus.
I'm sorry. Yeah, you're
Hmm.
Airbus, right, Mark? Airbus?
Yeah.
And I think, Mark, that's how some of the issues that we see today started, was this drive to be able to compete with Airbus and create a lower cost jetliner.
Yeah.
So, and I think, Boeing pretty much rushed 737 MAX so 2011, they decided to build this plane. It came out in 2017, which I think is actually pretty quick by commercial airline standards. I don't know. It was described in everything I read, Mark, it was described as a rush to get this plane out to maintain their
Their
competitive
dominance.
edge. Yeah, yeah, with Airbus, because it sounds like, initially they were the dominant, and just like you said, if it's not Boeing, I'm not going, right? That used to be the saying. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. Going back a little bit with this Airbus competition, it's really a fascinating study in business and just kind of competitive culture, the nature of business competition. One of the things, it wasn't, Airbus came out with, of course, a whole line of different aircraft, but from my memory and then from some recent research, it really seems like one of the most significant entries into the market was, of course, this mass, these large planes, ending with the 380.
Mhm.
And Airbus was betting on, from what I can ascertain, they were betting that the the transportation industry, as far as airlines, was going to move towards more of this, 600 people on one plane, 700 people, I think, going from these very, very large hubs, point A to point B, and then distribute from there. And this was something that, up until that point, had been led with the 747, of course. Well, one of the things that, I think that business wise, and it's proven to be true, that Boeing did right, they actually went the other way. And they went to developing brand new developments, not like the revamping of the 737, but looking at the 767 and the 777. Of course, ultimately, they weren't as nearly as large as the 380s, but Boeing bet that there was going to be less specific hub to hub needs and more regional needs. So you talk internationally. So they went with a smaller jumbo jet that was more fuel efficient, and it paid off because now Airbus has, I believe, they've ended production of the 380. It hasn't worked out economically like they thought that it would. What's the point of all this? The point of all this is it comes down to competition. Boeing got some things right in the business sense, but certainly because of their really kind of a once in a lifetime at this level competition. They had Douglas, they had, other manufacturers, but really nothing like this before with Airbus. And I think that in their rush to keep their dominance, they got some things right, but unfortunately and literally fatally, they get other things wrong. So, and it takes us up to the max you're talking about.
Yeah, and I think, the other part of that is the rush and also the desire to keep costs low. And there's some really specific things that we'll talk about where they made the decision to do certain things to keep the costs low, and that ended up having really deadly consequences, right? So
Yes.
so they get this plane in production. I think, like I said, that the maiden flight of the first one that was delivered, I don't remember what airline it was delivered to, but the first one was delivered. That's the 737 Max 8 or 800. Is that what it was called, or just
I think it was 800.
737 Max? Yeah,
Yeah, 800, I believe. Yeah.
yeah. I think the first one was delivered in 17. So
Mhm.
October 29th, 2018, Lion Air Flight 610 takes off from Jakarta, 6:20 a.m. 12 minutes after takeoff, the plane crashes into the sea and 189 people were killed, right?
Mhm.
Many countries at that time grounded the 737 because I guess as the facts came to light, there were some strange occurrences in what happened, or they couldn't really pinpoint what happened. Fast forward to March 2019, Ethiopian Air Flight 302 took off 8:38 a.m. 6 minutes after takeoff, it crashed. Everyone on board killed again. And as they examined these two crashes, they found almost identical information from the onboard instrument recordings, right? The black box, I guess, is what it's called. The
Right.
the black box recordings were, almost identical about the causes of both accidents. And interestingly, the US, like I said, was slower to act than other countries. China and the EU grounded the planes first, and it wasn't until after the second incident that the US actually grounded the planes and stopped, asked Boeing to stop delivery of new planes till they could figure out what happened. I don't know that there's anything, too strange about that. I think at the time, the the narrative that was pushed by Boeing, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, with what you
Mhm.
saw, but they were kind of pushing that it was a pilot experience issue, or that it may have been pilot error. Even President Trump tweeted something to the effect that, "Hey, flying a plane is different today than it was years ago, and now we need MIT engineers, not necessarily pilots." In other words, it's super electronical, very
Yeah.
computer driven. What do you make of that?
It's obviously a vast, vast topic. One of my college roommates was an aeronautical engineer, and again, this is going back 30 plus years now, and heck, 40 years. What am I talking about? Dating myself. And he went on to become a commercial pilot, and he flies 777s now, I believe, for United.
Mhm.
I happened to be talking to him about 2 months ago, Bill. We had a long conversation, hadn't talked in years, and had a great conversation. I asked him about these things long before I had any idea that you and I would be doing this topic, was just my curiosity. I asked him, I said, "Ted, what is it like? In other words, the advancement in the aircraft, the automation, the redundancy, things like this." He said, "Mark," he said, "look, once this plane is 200 feet in the air, it flies itself. That's it."
Mhm.
Now, again, this is what I was told by
Mhm.
a pilot.
Mhm.
And he said they'll land themselves, the whole kid and caboodle. Now, from a layman's point of view, from my point of view, that's a double-edged sword, of course. That's great. It's great that these planes are are this well designed as far as automation, as far as the software and things like this, that they can fly themselves like in an emergency. But you have to wonder, how much training do pilots miss out on when they're not actually physically flying the plane for 9 or
Mhm.
10 or 11 hours internationally? In other words, your best training is on the job. We all know that. That's the best training you can get is real life action. So I know they go through trainings like this, but it just my thought was, does this actually dull the senses and the expertise of pilots if they're not engaged? Now, one of the things that I looked up here about those crashes you're talking about back in, was it 18 and 19,
Mhm.
took so many lives. So from what I can read, Bill, this was a response by Boeing that I guess there have been some stall problems
Mhm.
with some planes. And for those of you who don't, I know a little bit about planes, at least how they work. You can't fly one, but a stall is basically when you lose lift over the wing. Okay, the plane's going too slow, the angle of attack is wrong, whatever it is. You lose lift, the plane falls out of the sky. And so some of these planes were having some stall problems, and obviously the data recorders and the pilots themselves are indicating, hey, we're having stall problems. So Boeing goes in and they introduce a new software to counteract these stall problems. Now, what I read this long, this very extensive article, which is really well from the Harvard Business School, whatever, about this. From what I can ascertain, these software updates were done without FAA's recertification or knowledge.
Yep.
And maybe you read too, Bill, about this. This is what I found out. This is the part that's really bizarre. And these software updates apparently will take over for the pilot if they detect something wrong. A lot of these pilots apparently were not aware of it, and apparently these two that went down were not aware of it.
Man, that's right on point, Mark. Right on point. So what happened with this new plane, the re-engined plane? The new fuel efficient engine they were going to put on this Max was much bigger and much heavier than the last one. So they had, my understanding is they had to move it forward on the wing and higher up on the wing, and it
Hmm.
caused that exact issue that you described, the potential stalling problem, right? Where it
Hmm.
would somehow affect lift or the angle of the plane or whatever. So the engineers talked about it and they said, hey, we have this thing called MCAS, Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System. And it had been used on other aircraft in the past. I think though military aircraft that were doing like super aggressive maneuvers. And the way it was explained originally was it was the computer would make subtle adjustments to the flying of the plane, the inputs that the pilot would generally put on the plane to smooth out the flight. Of course, with the system that Boeing put in place in with this plane, apparently the movement of the control surfaces was like 4 times as great as what had been approved by FAA in the past. Scary. So they have this system. It's only on the MAX. It's not on other 737s. So that means, Mark, just like you said, if you had been a pilot flying 737s your whole career and your company, whatever airline it is, buys this MAX and they don't tell you there's new systems on it, or they don't tell you, in fact, they specifically tell you, Mark, that additional training is not required to fly this plane. And why do they tell you that? Dollars and cents.
Oh, of course,
Yeah.
it costs money.
So here's the deal with Southwest Airline, they had offered Southwest a rebate of $1 million a plane if additional simulator training time was required to transition to this plane. So the whole thing, as they marketed this plane, it was a turnkey thing, no additional training. Hey, Mark, think back to Highway Patrol days. Let's say the Highway Patrol was going to issue a different handgun. I don't know what, when you started, was it Beretta? Was it SIG? What was it?
S- Smith and Wesson, Smith
Yeah,
and Wesson
that's
40 caliber. And just so you know, yeah, in my 30 years there, we actually transitioned twice. Started off with the one gun, and then we went
yep.
to another and another before I retired.
So was it, when you say went to another, was it a different maker?
So they were all the same. They were all Smith and Wessons,
Okay.
but they were different models. And
Yep.
yes, we went through dozens of hours,
Yep.
literally. In fact, the third gun that I used, we went through 2 full days
Yep.
of in classroom and range time with that gun, Bill.
And why did they do that? because it's a
because
different,
it's a different platform.
a different platform. There's, in order to handle it and use it safely, there's different training. When I started, Mark, it was really strange. In '92, the agency was going back and forth between Sig Sauer and Glock. So literally, one class might be issued Sig Sauer and the next one Glock, whatever the case. And I was issued a Sig Sauer. I could carry a Glock, but in order to do that, I had to go through, like you said, an extensive training, familiarization course. And again, that's done because it's a different platform and you have to learn how to do it safely. Training costs money. And especially for airlines, when that pilot's training, he's not flying, which means someone has to cover those flights, et cetera. You could see all the additional costs that accrue from that. A big part of Boeing's marketing of this jet to keep the cost low and to compete with the Airbus was them saying, hey, this requires no additional training. It's a turnkey jet, hop in and take off. And it turns
Mhm.
out that wasn't the case. This is a Dallas Morning News article, Mark. Here's what one pilot said about just what we're talking about right now. He said it was unconscionable that a manufacturer, the FAA, and the airlines would have pilots flying an airplane without adequately training them or even providing available resources and sufficient documentation to understand the highly complex systems that differentiate this aircraft from prior models.
Mhm.
The pilots didn't know MCAS existed. And like I said, Boeing had agreed to rebate 1 million per plane if training was deemed necessary by significant changes to the platform. So it was in their best business interests to really try to make it seem like the same old plane. In fact, at one point, Mark, did you see that they actually requested that the FAA allow them to delete all references from MCAS from their proposal, right?
Yes.
That's crazy.
It is crazy, and you use the word I think that's really most appropriate, unconscionable. I think, one of the things, and there's so much here to talk about, why we got to this point, how we got to this point with Boeing. But I think one of the large aspects of this is this culture of reliance on technology. In other words, that people think, well, because it's a new system and because we as managers, things like this, the CEO, whoever it is, we think that based on the data, based on what our team is telling us, that this thing works flawlessly. Well, you know what? So does my iPhone, so does my Android, so it will too in the plane. I think there's a lot of that going on here, Bill, where people just rely on the virtual rather than enough of the human aspect.
Mhm.
And I think this is certainly part of the culture, a small part, but a significant part that resulted in these deaths and other incidents. So it's really, from my point of view, and I think yours as well, like you said, how could this happen? How could any software update not be part of a training manual? I
Mhm.
mean, it just doesn't make, a training regimen. It doesn't
Right,
make sense to me. But here we
right.
are.
Here's something that I found fascinating, or let me say, I don't know, fascinating, but I had never heard this before. I was doing research on this, and this was reported by Bloomberg. So the Lion Air flight that crashed, right? The day before it crashed, there was an off-duty pilot traveling on the plane in the cockpit. I don't know what they call that, deadheading or
Yeah,
whatever.
deadheading, yeah.
Okay, so he was
Mhm,
flying home and he was sitting in the cockpit with the pilots. The Now this is the same plane that crashed a couple days later. The
mhm,
plane went into a nosedive. Okay, the off-duty pilot correctly, this is the off-duty guy, correctly diagnosed the issue, disabled the flight control system, and saved the plane. The next day, completely different crew, right?
mhm.
So they hadn't experienced what had happened the day before. There was no, I don't know, what do you call that, Mark, when you're passing on a turnover? Like you're passing on information. Let's say you were
Yeah.
at a command post somewhere in a
Mhm,
critical incident. Someone
mhm.
comes in to relieve you. What kind of turnover there is, or how you're passing information to the next
Really,
flight crew.
information continuity. I mean, that's
Yeah.
what we're talking about, yeah.
So a crew comes on the next day, literally the next day, it happened again, and everyone on board died.
Mhm.
I mean, That's troubling. Don't you think that there would be some kind of turnover for those pilots coming on the plane the next day to say, "Hey, this plane had this issue 24 hours ago. Here's what happened. Here's how it was addressed." But apparently none of that happened, and it literally the next day, the same thing happened, and the pilots didn't correctly assess the situation. And I'm not saying that to disparage them. I don't know, without the training, I don't know how you would actually make that diagnosis, right? But the plane crashed, and everyone died just because of that.
Well, Bill, this is an important point you bring up because I can't remember the name of the what was the name of the airline that were
Lions Air?
yeah, Lions Air. In other words, this is an example there where either this deadhead pilot either violated company protocol by not sharing critical information, or there was no company protocol about sharing information. One or other, or the other has to be true. You would think this if this is an employee, this is a pilot, a certified pilot, and he detects something wrong, either mechanically or software avionics with an airline, with an airplane, you would think that he'd be required to report that um to superiors. I don't know, but it's another example where the human element here could have even overcome some of these shortcomings with Boeing and some of the cutting of corners. But I mean, in other words, I just want to focus here on the human element here. It seems
Right,
like somehow, like you said, this information didn't get passed on, and why not?
right. And that seems like a basic thing that, there would be some kind of log, or there should be some kind of log, and it would just talk about abnormalities and how they were addressed and what happened, and any,
Mhm.
even if it was just in the maintenance log of the plane, you would think that
Right.
would be say, "Hey, here's what happened. We did this to correct it." Just like if you had a black and white that you were driving that experienced some
Mhm.
problem, you would think you would note it and say, like, "Check this," right?
And it happened too often than I like to admit to. In other words, you
Right.
get in your black and white, and it's like, you gotta be dude, the electrolock here for the rifle's not working and you didn't put it. There's a logbook. There's a
Yeah.
logbook, whatever. And in something like that, you'd be required to take the weapon out and to stow it securely, in the gun room, things like this. But that was a very by the way, that example is extremely rare, fortunately, but other mechanical things. But my point to all this is that there's also clearly a communications breakdown within Boeing about, hey, we're going to go ahead and implement or install this new software. We're not going to tell anybody about it.
Mhm.
It's another example of humans not talking to humans and being made aware of significant changes. Same thing here with this particular airline. The pilots didn't communicate, or
Yeah.
probably didn't communicate to superiors.
Yep, and I think that's a key piece to this. Another thing that I thought was interesting was, and the New York Times did some phenomenal reporting on this, as it was being investigated, et cetera. Believe it or not, the Lions jet, or the Lion Airlines jet, lacked some safety features because those safety features were sold as options by Boeing, additional cost options. So there was a warning light that would have said, "Hey, this system has been activated, et cetera," and it wasn't on this particular plane because it was an upgrade option that they didn't choose to get. Now,
Mhm.
from what I read, since that time, Boeing has done away with that, and
Mhm.
all safety options are on all airplanes that they produce. But that's another kind of crazy thing where you're paying extra for additional safety. And I kind of look at like the automobile industry, and I don't think, has there ever been a time, Mark, that you recall where, airbags were an extra added cost, or seat belts were an extra added cost back in the day? I don't think so.
Yeah, it's an interesting comparison, and I think a very fair one. Here's what's common to automobiles and airlines. In other words, there are federal agencies that are responsible for overseeing and certifying both of these vehicles, cars or planes.
Hmm.
And obviously, for Boeing to be able to offer certain safety enhancements as options, the FAA must have made that possible. You can sell
Hmm.
the plane with this basic package, so to speak, and you can offer these other enhancements as add-ons. So there's a case where the FAA obviously was aware, otherwise the plane wouldn't pass certification.
Yeah. And I guess I don't know if we mentioned this yet, Bark, but apparently, like FAA had to sign off on the fact that no additional training was needed
Yeah.
to on this plane.
Hmm.
And I had noted that this saved Boeing a ton of money. They didn't have to factor that training into the bid when they were costing these planes out.
Hmm.
The tragic thing is on the cockpit voice recorder, at least on the Lions Air flight, that you could hear the pilots going through the manual,
Yeah.
literally paging through the manual, looking for a solution
Mhm.
to what's happening as they're plummeting toward the earth.
Yeah.
So Mark, this is where it gets into the kind of dirty part of this whole thing, at least with respect to the MCAS system. There were congressional hearings, and through that and leaked documents, it looks like as early as 2012, Boeing, at least some people in Boeing's leadership, knew that this MCAS system could cause crashes by forcing the plane into a nosedive and overriding pilot control. And they put the software on there anyway. They alleviated the necessity for training anyway. And, it seems almost like they tried to conceal the existence of this new program from pilots because they took references to it out of the manuals and stuff. I don't know, that's troubling that they kinda knew about it, and there was even one test pilot who flew the plane and experienced that issue. Did you see that? Where a test pilot flew the plane and experienced that issue and
No,
said,
I
"Hey,
actually,
th"
I missed that specific.
Okay. Yeah, there
Hmm.
was a test pilot who flew the plane and experienced that issue and questioned them on it, and they just kinda, brushed it over. I know one thing that struck me was, and it goes to, I guess, big business in general. After the first crash, the FAA apparently did a study, and the statistics they got, or how they quantified it, they said that if nothing was done, there would be a crash every other year. That's what the FAA said. Based on, I guess they looked at how many flights the this type of plane had made, et cetera, et cetera. There'd be a crash every other year. So they say that there was a almost negligible chance that there would be another issue in the near term before Boeing was able to fix the problem. And they
Hmm.
say that's why they didn't ground the plane immediately after the first crash.
Hmm.
Well, statistics, didn't
It,
work.
it didn't pan out, and I
No.
know it's relatively easy for us to say, well, of the tens of millions of flights, one crash every other year, is that acceptable? And I don't want to sit in a high horse and we understand that flying is still the safest mode of transportation, even under these circumstances. But the difference is here is if you actually know specifically of something that can be corrected, could be corrected, or at least addressed, and you don't because the odds of it happening are so low. I don't understand that mentality, Bill. I really don't, especially when you are literally the governing body over their certifications of these aircraft and over the airline industry. So that that just seems bizarre to me. I don't get it. You and I, we're up in the air like so many people listening a lot, and you just wonder, aren't these agencies, aren't these companies, aren't they supposed to be responsible? Aren't they supposed to be doing everything humanly possible to make these aircraft as safe as possible?
Yeah.
I hope so. I don't know if
It,
that's it's true. It certainly doesn't seem that way with Boeing right now.
yeah, and let's then talk about how some of the oversights delegated. I think that's probably a next thing to do. So, and actually it was leadership within the FAA, believe it or not. And I don't know, maybe that comes from, hey, Boeing is trying to get this thing approved as quick as possible to get it to market. There's lobbyists engaged in that. We all know how lobbyists work in Washington, D.C. The leadership within the FAA was pushing the engineers to delegate safety assessments to Boeing and to speedily approve the results. So
Mhm.
obviously, someone was pressuring the FAA to get this thing approved and get it done. Now, delegation of safety assessments, et cetera. My understanding, Mark, and correct me if you know different, was that this was originally allowed for basically trivial things. In other words, did a bathroom sign meet the standards set by the FAA? Or did the paint meet a standard, a safety standard set by the FAA? Not major things like software changes and automated flight systems. It seems like over time, this delegation kind of morphed into self regulation where
Yeah.
Boeing was kind of just tasked with regulating itself. Is there something that that I'm
No,
missing with that?
I don't think so, Bill. It does seem like that. And when you look at the number of incidents, obviously the doors, the wheels, these things
Mm,
falling off. Now, again, I want to be careful here because when you have the one shark attack, now every news outlet is looking for every shark attack around the world. And
mhm,
this happens these cycles. You look at all the news coverage and the number of shark attacks because it becomes sensational for one reason or another, or you have two in a relative short period of time. And it looks like that's the end of the world, that, sharks are now walking onto the beaches and, that are grabbing people and dragging them back in the water. And you go back and look at the stats over 100 years. You go, oh my God, wait a minute. We had fewer shark attacks over the last 2 years than the previous, 5 years, but it looks worse on television. I will say that I believe this is different. And the reason it's different is because there's no doubt the media is all over this, and by the way, and they should be.
mhm.
And I think that if we had any mechanical failures or any pilot error on any other manufacturer, it would be getting just as much coverage, by media as it is with Boeing right now, because the whole idea of airline safety is certainly foremost right now in the media. So I think that what we're seeing is probably representative compared to the low number of incidents over, previous years. To that point, and what you're saying, Bill, about, Boeing becoming self-regulating, one of the things I read in this article, and I remember when this happened, but I didn't know this about this other previous competitor of Boeing until I read this article. So it says that CEO Philip Condit, who took over for Boeing in the late 90s, he made a couple of changes to Boeing's culture. The first was acquiring arch rival McDonnell Douglas in 1997,
Hmm.
a leader in military aviation with its fighter jets and Boeing's major competitor in commercial aviation. In contrast to Boeing's culture of engineering excellence, McDonnell Douglas focused on cost cutting and upgrading older airplane models at the expense of all new aircraft.
Mm.
And we saw that happen, of course, all the way bleeding up into the 737. Again, when I was a kid, pretty much watching the 737, flying the 737, and seeing it upgraded so many times, which you kind of opened with, Bill, about upgrading the same platform, extending it, different engines, different software, different this, different that. And I don't think that we're talking about self-regulation. We're talking about whatever pressure that Boeing may have put on the FAA, things like this. We can't overlook something this foundational, I don't believe, when you talk about taking over McDonnell Douglas, which is a huge company. And McDonnell Douglas probably did not have the same focus on excellence as Boeing did. There's a reason that Boeing had the reputation that it did, because people in and outside the industry compare Boeing's safety record to all of the other manufacturers. And for 50, 60, 70 years, Boeing stood out. But there certainly was a cultural change. There's a lot more here in this article, but I think that is an important point to focus on when you talk about how do we get from where we were to where we are now with Boeing.
Yeah, and I know, the one thing that was one of the pressures was people from the FAA that had left the agency become lobbyists. And just like we saw with in big pharma with, opiates, the people that left FDA or left DEA and became lobbyists and then pressured Congress. The same thing happened here where people left the FAA, became lobbyists or went to work for lobbyist firms and then began pressuring Congress, legislature to get these things approved because what it meant for business. And this is an American company and we have to compete internationally, et cetera, et cetera. Interesting, Mark, that through this whole 737 MAX thing, the price of the stock went from about 340 down to about 150. So the company lost more than 50% of its value by what, poor decision making, or what would you, I don't, that's not even, that doesn't even do it justice. It, kind of the, I guess, bad culture, I guess,
Well,
because of the bad culture then.
yeah, I think bad culture. And I think, in other words, it's a kind of a refocus of its priorities. I think
Right.
that's and certainly there's cost cutting, and of course with Airbus, the competition. I think that Boeing, the leadership, again, it's just a refocusing of priorities. To continue with Condit and the
Hmm.
CEO then, and I've been there many times up to in Seattle where Boeing's original facility was, and I mean, it's just sprawling is an understatement. I think at one point, or maybe it still is, it's the largest under one roof building in the world, I believe. I could be
Hmm.
wrong about that, but in 2001, he moved Boeing's headquarters from its original home in Seattle to Chicago, all to gain $60 million in state and local tax credits over 20 years.
Hmm.
Now, when you think about this, this is a very small amount of savings, $60 million over 20 years.
Hmm.
I think this is a misprint. I went and looked it up and it was accurate, but it says with none of its businesses based in Chicago, the move separated Boeing's corporate executives from its engineering and product decisions and alienated its Seattle-based engineers. This is very important to me because we're talking earlier about the human communication bill, and having most of its operations under one roof, I think makes for better communication, instant communication, and human influence. So I think it's just another example of where Boeing was going here with leadership, and it was moving away from the direction that had gained its reputation that we knew prior to all this.
Mark, that's a great point you brought up because I know there was an independent panel that was set up by, I don't know if it was NTSB or Congress to look at this, to look at the MCAS and 737 MAX issues. And one of the things that they focused on was communication. And it was engineers being disconnected from executive leadership. And I think what you just described was one of the reasons why that happened, the move of the corporate headquarters. I think it's fair to say probably that, at least I know there was a guy named Alan Mullally who ran the commercial passenger plane part of Boeing at one point, and he was, I think, one of the last inside engineers to be in that position. And I think kind of the issues that we're describing are what happens when that kind of transition from an engineering based company to I don't know what you would say, a bean counter based, you know,
Seems like it.
they really started focusing more. The focus became more on cutting costs than production quality. I mean, that's what it seemed like to me from reading this, right? And I think that had part of the effect. So a couple more things to talk about with Boeing, Mark. One is the door plug. This recent incident this past January. Um, hey, I said the stock was at 150 after the 737 Max MCAS issues. It went back up to 250, and then after these door plug issues, back down to $175 a share. So these repeated issues are costing the company huge amounts of money, or at least of value. And the current CEO, is it David Calhoun?
I believe so.
Yeah,
Yeah, you know what?
he announced that he's stepping down the end of the
Mhm.
year. So this was January 5th, 2024. It was an Alaskan Airlines flight, a 737 Max 9, which I guess is the next iteration after the door plug blew out. Now, Mark, here's another one, just like I talked about with that Lions Air flight. I don't know. And again, people, the Lions Air flight where the crew the day before experienced the same problem, but we don't know if it was ever documented or if there was any transfer of knowledge to the next crew the next day.
Mhm.
Listen to this about this this 737-9 that Alaskan Air had. And again, this goes to air. This isn't Boeing. This is where airlines probably need to develop better communication. This
Hmm.
particular plane had been banned from flying over the ocean to Hawaii because of pressurization problems, which were either not properly diagnosed or solved. A pressurization fail light had illuminated several times. So probably there were issues. This is a little bit speculation, but it makes sense. Issues with this door plug were ongoing. There was a pressure leak. This warning light was going off in the cockpit. And each time they would maintenance would just test the light works and reset it,
Hmm.
you know? So,
Yep.
but to be safe, they said the plane can't fly over water for a long period of time. I mean,
That's
it
not being
sounds like,
safe to me.
no, that doesn't
That's
sound
not being safe.
sufficient.
We're going to fix the problem by altering the original purpose of the plane. We're not going to let it fly over water.
Right.
It it's really bizarre. And we talk about culture, Bill. You alluded to this. Is that a number of issues that pop up with planes or automobiles, things like this? They actually come from the people that are operating them.
Hmm.
Sometimes these things don't arise until a number of cycles. We're talking about planes with pressurization, landings, takeoffs. In other words, all the repetition on these airframes or on systems. Sometimes they should be caught in testing, but sometimes they're not. That is just a fact for every manufacturer. It doesn't matter who it is. But that information is normally relayed to the manufacturer, the head of an airline, things like this, to assess it. So, but like you said, it's not just Boeing. Certainly, there's
Hmm.
obviously problems there, but when you have people that are literally with their hands on the yoke and the pedals, and they're not disseminating information, sharing information, that's a breakdown that's unforgivable as well, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Obviously, yeah.
And, I have a neighbor who's a pilot, and I was talking with him about this. He's retired a little bit. And he said, hey, also, which goes to kind of this piece that we're talking about here. He said, some of these issues he feels are maintenance issues.
Hmm.
Even with the MCAS system,
Hmm.
the sensors that were giving the false reading, which would
Hmm.
cause the planes to go into a nosedive on the 737-800,
Hmm.
those were miscalibrated often by maintenance workers, whether they didn't have an understanding of how to do it properly or there was no checks and balances or whatever. But a lot of times, there's maintenance issues. And I think now we're to the point where just everything's getting blamed on the manufacturer. I guess that's the point I'm making. We see a tire blowout and we say, oh, Boeing can't make a quality product. But what I'm saying is there's also, from what I'm hearing, issues with maintenance and doing maintenance properly also. So as far as a door plug goes, interesting thing which I was kind of surprised to hear is thank God there was no one sitting in the two seats next to the bulkhead where that piece blew out. But the suction was or the vacuum was so strong that it ripped the cockpit door open, which I thought those things were like multiple deadbolted now. But
I
this
did
is
too.
what the report I read said it ripped the cockpit door open and actually pinned the lavatory door shut then. And they couldn't, just because of the suction, couldn't close the cockpit door. The headphones were ripped off the co-pilot, so the co-pilot was not able to communicate. They had a laminated, like a procedural checklist that
Hmm.
blew out of the cockpit, so they no longer had that at their fingertips. And half the headphones were ripped off the pilot. So kind of just the perfect storm, and an example of what happens when a plane depressurizes. Obviously, they kept it in the air. Thank God no one was hurt, but creates significant issues for the crew trying to then safely land the plane. So here's what I didn't know about this. Well, they found out that four key bolts were not in place when the door. Forensic analysis. They said, hey, there were four bolts missing from this door plug. And what a door plug is I guess there's an option for an additional emergency exit at that point in the bulkhead, depending on how the plane is configured. And in this case, Alaskan Airlines didn't want the emergency exit there, so they just put a solid bulkhead wall there with windows, whatever, and bolted in place, and it looks like just part of the interior. So four bolts had not been installed. Now, when I initially heard that, I thought that was from the factory. Like when Boeing produced the plane, I thought those four bolts were missing. Here's what actually happened. The door plug was originally installed by Spirit Aerosystems in Wichita, Kansas, right? And then it was shipped to Boeing's factory in Renton, Washington. Once it arrived there, NTSB says that Boeing observed damaged rivets on the fuselage that required the door plug to be opened for repairs. So they saw some, I guess Boeing saw what they would call production defects from Spirit Air, these rivets that were not right or whatever. In order to fix it, they had to pull the door plug out, make the repairs, and then put the door plug back in. And that's the point at which these 4 bolts were not uh, properly replaced. Um, it was done by Spirit Aero workers at the Boeing plant, though. That's the
Mm.
distinction. I guess they have a crew of their workers working at the Boeing plant to do those repairs. Now, interestingly, Mark, I don't know if you saw this, but they haven't been able to really they've not identified who was responsible for that repair.
Mm.
And I don't know whether that's Boeing covering for the people or if their systems are, I'm going to just say, so lax that they
Yeah.
actually don't know who did the repair. But here's a letter from NTSB to Congress, and NTSB is kind of reporting on what they have learned so far. This was just in March 13th. It's dated. I'm going to skip to the important parts here. It says, at the hearing, this is NTSB again reporting to Congress. At a previous hearing, you asked whether we have gotten timely access to the documents, the information, and the witnesses we need. Specifically, you asked that I inform the committee in writing no later than today whether Boeing has provided documentation on the work to open, reinstall, and close the door plug and a list of the 25 door crew employees. Let's see. To date, we still do not know who performed the work to open, reinstall, and close the door plug on the accident aircraft. Boeing has informed us that they are unable to find the records documenting the work. A verbal request was made by our investigators for security camera footage to help obtain this information. However, they were informed the footage was overwritten. The absence of those records will complicate the NTSB's investigation moving forward. So I don't know if it's been resolved. I'm sorry, I don't know if it's been resolved since the
Mhm.
middle of March, but that was
That's
what do you think of
bizarre.
that? Yeah,
Yeah,
right?
and that's news to me, Bill. But that's 2 points you made that I was not aware of. They're fascinating. One, that it was done by Spirit Air at a Boeing facility, and that they can't figure out who it was. I didn't know. Now, again, maybe this is industry practice, standard. It's been going on for forever. I don't know, but it does seem unusual to me. Now, maybe they do this for training purposes. I don't know. I don't understand why that would happen. But to me, if I don't care who it is, if there is a mechanic performing maintenance or repairs on an airframe under a Boeing roof, it still seems to me that Boeing should have some oversight, be
Mhm.
responsible to some degree before that airframe leaves the facility. Number two, very interesting point you made. We can't find the records. That's of who did it. That seems to me, absolutely basic. That really for 20 years, you should know who actually put a rivet into a plane. You should actually know who connected this wire harness from the cockpit to the flight systems to the it's bizarre to me that there's not a detailed record of who's doing what on a plane like this. You have to know these things. If for nothing else, training purposes, you want to know
Mhm.
who was performing their job the way they're supposed to. And you would think that all these these workers, these mechanics would have somebody coming by with a clipboard, so to speak, and checking their
Yeah.
work. So you'd
Yeah.
have a supervisor or manager who would record this and say, yeah, it's XYZ person did this job. Either Either there's something nefarious going on, or like you said, Boeing slash Spirit have really, really crappy records keeping process. I don't know which one, but either one's horrible.
Yeah. And I think, one thing which I know we probably don't have, we don't have time really to talk about today, but it's the whole, another cost saving thing that Boeing did, and I don't know, it might have been under that CEO's leadership, the gentleman who you mentioned earlier, was Spirit Aero technically was part of Boeing originally, and they spun it off. And this whole idea of outsourcing and contracting out parts of the work necessary to produce a plane to save money. And even in law enforcement, Mark, there were some parts of work that are contracted out, whether it's contract pilots, contract this, contract that. And you do lose some oversight and quality control ability when you do that. And I think, I think that's another part of the issue that we're seeing here is some of these processes and production things were outsourced, and it kind of limited what Boeing's role was in ensuring a quality final product. I don't know.
Oh, I agree. And by the
Yeah.
way, if you look at the list of CEOs, and not just CEOs, but different high-ranking officials in Boeing over the last 20 plus years, in my opinion, you'll see that they actually didn't pick the best people for the particular job. They picked people for different reasons. Again, my humble opinion.
Right.
And I think this contributed to the watering down of quality control throughout the entire company.
Yep. So company hasn't been profitable since 2018, and there were about 50 recommendations made by FAA. This is with respect to the door plug issue, and most of them focused around organizational issues like who answers to who and the reporting chains and also communication issues. Mark, one more thing I want to talk about, and then we'll wrap it, is two whistleblowers.
Mhm.
The two whistleblowers that came forward and have been outspoken about some issues at Boeing over the last number of years. First one is John Barnett. Now, interesting story, Mark. I don't know if you're familiar with him. Are you familiar with him or?
A little bit.
Yeah, so interesting story with him because he was found dead in his car mid deposition. So he had been doing a deposition in South Carolina. I don't know if it was like Thursday, Friday, Saturday, or something, or maybe it was even deposition prep. But whatever it was over a weekend. He didn't show up. They went to look for him, and they found him outside his in a car outside his Holiday Inn in Charleston, dead in the car, gunshot wound to the head, and gun in his hand. Strange one. He was a quality control manager who retired in 2017, and he worked at Boeing for 30 years. One of the things he talked about, and I think it's almost what you touched on earlier, Mark, was it sounds like he was very critical of this transition, and it sounds like the transition he was talking about was the joining with McDonnell Douglas. He said that we had these military folks came in, and it was all about the culture was completely different. It was all about cutting costs, cutting costs, cutting costs, and he he was not happy with quality control. And again, that was his responsibility. I think he said something to the effect that there wasn't a single plane that left the facility where he worked on the East Coast in the Carolinas that he would sign his name to as being safe. That's pretty strong
Yep.
language. You know, the interesting thing about him is a friend of the family. So this comes down to the I'm trying to think of the proper way to term this, Mark. So we don't. So yeah, we can ensure the widest distribution of this video as possible. Let me put it that way. There was a friend of the family that said that she had spoken with him, and he said, "I'm not scared, but if anything happens to me, it's not my own doing." And that weren't his exact words. He used a different word to describe his end, but and she said, "I know that his death was not self-induced. There's no way. He loved life too much. He loved his family too much. He loved his brothers too much to put them through what they're going through right now. I think somebody didn't like what he had to say and wanted to shut him up and didn't want it to come back on anyone. So that's why they made it look the way it did." I don't know, Mark. We haven't seen any of the specific reports or anything. There was the report, this newspaper report that I read said he had a gun in his hand, finger still on the trigger, and there was a note in the car. Of course, it didn't give details of what was in the note or anything else, but he exposed the role of Boeing's military connections, and I guess that comes from the McDonnell Douglas merger, probably, right?
Yes.
The
Yeah.
entire This is what he said. The entire team came down from the military. Their motto was, "We're in Charleston and we can do anything we want." they started pressuring us not to document defects, to work outside procedures, to allow defective material to be installed without being corrected. And one of the things that he took issue with was how they would make panels fit together. Like if there were gaps in panels, he just says they would use like excessive force and kind of force things to fit. And that down the road, that would affect the airworthiness of the plane, etc. You have any thoughts, Mark, on his death or anything like that? I mean, he worked there 30 years and he'd been
Mhm.
a whistleblower since 2017. And all of a sudden, all these things come to light, which kind of lends some support to some of the claims he was making. And then he's found dead in his car in the middle of a deposition.
Well, look, it's certainly intriguing. It's certainly intriguing. Um, the timing, the coincidence. One of the things, I forget who the woman was you were quoting about him, and I'd heard when I said I knew a little bit about him. That was one of the things I'd heard where she said that he was saying things that people didn't want to hear. Well, there's no dispute about that.
Mhm.
Certainly, Boeing and other people wouldn't want these types of allegations made public. There's no doubt about it. Did somebody off this guy and try to make it look like a suicide? I don't know. And nobody besides that gentleman and the possible suspect or suspects behind his death would know that, if there are any. At least that's this point. Just don't know. But it is intriguing. And this is the problem when a company, an entity, a government start engaging in behavior that they shouldn't behave in, or they start losing quality control, things like this, without 100% transparency and really, all the effort in the world to right the ship. When things like this happen, when the suicide, at least reported suicide of a whistleblower occurs in conjunction with what's coming out, how else will it look? What else would it look like
Mhm.
than this was an attempt to silence a person? I don't know if that happened or not. I don't know if this was just somebody under a tremendous amount of stress, took his own
Mhm.
life at a publicly, let's put it this way, inopportune time that could result in looking like a conspiracy. I just don't know. But these are the types of conspiracies that can be created, or at least the appearance of a conspiracy,
Yeah.
when it happens in conjunction with other people's malfeasance. And so I think it's where we are right now, and it, we'll probably never know exactly what happened to this person, but here we
Yeah.
are.
And then the last thing, Mark, is a second whistleblower, Sam Salapur.
Yeah, this
Uh,
name I don't know.
okay, so he was also a
Mhm,
quality engineer. He testified before Congress last week, couple weeks ago.
mhm.
Here's what he says. He says the fuselages were improperly joined together and excessive force was used to minimize gaps. Same thing we
Same
heard from the
thing.
other guy.
Mhm.
And he said this sped up the production process. He says that, which does make me think more about Mr. Barnett. He says that he was threatened with physical violence for bringing these things for bringing these things to light,
Did he
and
say
he
by
was
whom,
moved.
Bill?
No, he didn't say by whom. I'm
Mhm,
assuming by. I mean, I guess I shouldn't, but I guess I'm assuming by his superiors or whoever he was,
mhm.
reporting it to, and he was moved to the 777 project where, by the way, he also saw panel misalignment issues. So 777 is a Dreamliner? Is that the
Yeah.
Dreamliner or is that the
Yeah,
787?
I think
Yeah.
777's Dreamliner. I
So,
should
I
know,
don't know, Mark.
my friend flies
You
it. Mm.
Mark, where does Boeing go from here? That's a tough question, right?
Yeah, it is a tough question. Actually looking for the name of the 777. I could Google it right now, but I think it's a Dreamliner. You know what? I was thinking about this for a while, not just during the show today, and where does Boeing go from here? It's a great question, Bill. It really is. I think that with this type of scrutiny, by the way, whether it's totally legitimate or not, because again, things ramp up, the temperature ramps up when there's a newsworthy story that's going on and on and on and on. But maybe I'm just being hopeful, but I'm thinking that really Boeing has no choice other than to right the ship, to
Mhm.
fix the problem. They really don't have any choice. One of the reasons they don't have a choice is because mainly Airbus, and there are others out there, but certainly Airbus, they're going to jump on swell. In other words, they're going to have to accelerate their safety protocols. This is a chance, I think, from a business point of view, for other manufacturers out there. And again, I'm going to focus on Airbus. I think this is probably their biggest rival. It's an opportunity now to create real separation.
Hmm.
They can now distinguish themselves from what the public perceives to be a slipshod, to some extent, operation with Boeing. This is an opportunity they didn't have 20 years ago or 30 years ago. That Boeing was the flag bearer of excellence. Now there's a gap. Now there's an opportunity. There's a chink in the armor. So I think from a survival point of view, that Boeing has no choice but now to spend way, way more energy, time, effort, money, human power to regain that reputation. It is not going to be easy. However, I think that is totally doable. I think that the shareholders are going to demand it. I think there are people internally now, especially with whistleblowers coming out. I think there will be enough momentum there now to go ahead and regain that, or at least try to recapture that that reputation. So again, I'm hopeful. Look, there's an emotional side of me. My dad flew in Boeings in World War II. I've always loved Boeing as a passenger. So I hope that Boeing comes back. I think they can, and only
Hmm.
time will tell.
Yeah. And it's tough. I mean, look at, if you're Airbus, look at the lessons they've learned free of charge from
Mhm.
this. If they're
Yep.
watching, look at the lessons they've learned free of charge. That's it. Very insightful comments there, Mark. Thanks for joining me to talk about this. Hopefully, we get back to a place where if it's Boeing, I'm going. Thanks.
Hopefully.
Yep.
Thank you.